Welcome to Writers and Books Visiting Author Series. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages, all currently available online. Our theme for 2021 is Taking Care. We're celebrating different ways we can take care of ourselves and take care of others this year. Check out our upcoming schedule at wab.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. You can also submit questions through the chat. All About Flowers is available through our bookstore Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. Just want to take a moment to acknowledge our funders here. We're so excited to have Thomas Mickey with us this evening for the launch of his book, All About Flowers. First, we'll hear from Thomas, then he'll be in conversation with garden writer and horticulturalist Kristen Froelich. James Vick's business selling flowers through the mail from Rochester, New York wasn't unique, but it was widely successful because he understood how to engage his customers' emotion. He sold the love of flowers along with flower seeds. In his new history, All About Flowers, James Vick's 19th century seed company, Thomas Mickey illustrates how Vick inspired gardeners everywhere with his passion for flower gardening and created the modern flower gardening as we know it today. Thomas J. Mickey is Professor Emeritus of Communication Studies at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. A graduate of the Boston Architectural College's Landscape Institute, he is a master gardener and a garden columnist. His earlier books include America's Romance with the English Garden and Best Garden Plants for New England. Thomas, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Dan.
I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everybody who has chosen to join us tonight on this journey to learn a little bit about James Vick. And I'm going to first talk about him a little bit, and then I'm going to read a section or two from the book. I mentioned we're going to learn a little bit about him because as I researched him, I learned more and more along the way, so that by the time I finished the research and felt I was ready, it had been quite a long time. James Vick had writing skills, he had management skills, but he had people skills. Those were the three areas where he excelled. His writing and publication skills made him fit for catalog production and magazine publishing, which is what he did. He had been a typesetter, a writer, an editor, and a publisher. He started his business just as flower gardening became popular in 1860. He provided instruction on landscape design as a setting for a flower garden at every home. And finally, he filled his flower garden with the flowers from important sources. So it became the quintessential Victorian garden. Let's first look at his writing experience. When he came to America, he and his family landed in New York, and he got a job as a typesetter with Horace Greeley at the Knickerbocker magazine. This is where he began his work life. When he arrived in Rochester a few years later, he was the foreman for Frederick Douglass's magazine newspaper, the North Star. The foreman was a person who organized the publication, was in charge of the typesetters and the printers, and managed all of them in order to get the production out. Then when he moved to Rochester after that, when he came to Rochester rather, he left North Star and then became a writer and editor of Genesee Farmer, which is a farmer's journal, very important one. But notice he was both writer and editor. He was showing his writing skill in the field of floriculture, horticulture at that time. In 1853, he took over the publication of probably the most important landscape design magazine in the 19th century, Andrew Jackson Downing's Horticulturalist. Andrew Jackson Downing had died suddenly in a boating accident on the Hudson, and Vick bought the magazine and brought it to Rochester. And for a whole year, he published that, which at that time was a gigantic job, because the magazine was so important and so many people were reading it. He decided to stop publication of that journal after 1 year and sold it, and the magazine moved to Albany. Then he published his own garden magazine called the Rural Annual and Horticultural Directory. He did this for a couple of years and then became horticultural editor of Moore's Rural New Yorker, probably the most important farm journal at that time in Western New York, read by everybody. And he was the editor for everything having to do with horticulture. And at this time was when he was also beginning his seed company. He was starting it in the early 1860s, the late 1850s, in the attic of his house. His son would package the seeds, and the two of them would take the seed packets to the post office the next day. But he was growing flowers and putting seeds out at that early stage. He started his business in the early 1860s when flower gardening really became important. The first half of the 19th century was devoted to growing vegetables, and only the wealthy could afford flower beds. But by 1860, when industrialization took place, there was more leisure time for the middle class and the working class. And there was a demand, there was a growing need for people to have flower gardens. And that took place, of course, from that point on till the end of the century. The flower gardens became more and more elaborate. And flower gardening at that time became the domain of women, housewives. And women who took over the garden were inspired because they were getting seeds to plant themselves. Popular books at that time, Every Woman Her Own Gardener. Women were being encouraged to get involved in the garden, and indeed they did that. And many of the letters to Vick really compliment him on supporting them, letters from women supporting them in their ventures into gardening. So Vick was also very important in that movement and encouraged women to get other people involved in gardening as well. Vick also provided landscape design for a homeowner. He was very sensitive to the design of Andrew Jackson Downing, which was basically the English style of gardening. And he included essays and drawings in his magazine and in his seed catalog on how to lay out a lawn, how to position trees to set the boundary for the property, how to have shrubs in groups of 3, and how to put your flower bed in the back, perhaps, but also in the front. He suggested a flower bed in the front that is round and became what was called at that time carpet bedding, where a design was in the flower bed. Like, for example, if it was round, it would be concentric circles of different plants, which would lead to the center, all clipped to have a certain dimension to it. That kind of carpet bed was very popular, and Vick was a promoter of that kind of flower garden design. He was at the forefront. He ultimately promoted perennials, but he saw at that time the importance of really tapping into a carpet bed, and he wanted his readers and his customers to do that as well. He was quite insistent on that. He filled the garden, this is really important, he filled the garden with the flowers from important sources. And these flowers became what we understand to be the Victorian garden. First and foremost, his flowers came from the native plant collection at that time, which included amaranthus, black-eyed Susan, sunflower, columbine, echinacea. These were flowers that prior to this period were often grown in English gardens. And because the English grew them quite successfully, they then became part of American gardens. It wasn't until they went over there and they looked so great that people decided here to grow them. So he was a big promoter of native plants. The second group was what is called English garden favorites. These are plants for the flower garden that went back decades, in some cases centuries, and had been part of the English garden, and people loved them and continued to grow them. These included plants like hollyhock, morning glory, nasturtium, calendula, and those were also sold in Vick's catalog. And the next group is called the exotic plants. These were plants that were from Asia, Africa, South America. These were becoming collector items in England during this period of time, and they would ultimately come to the US as well, exotics. And these really proliferated during the 19th century. People could not get enough of these plants. They were, for example, the petunia, the dahlia, the ricinus, the coleus. These are all standard plants for us today, but they were new to American gardeners, new to the Victorian garden. And finally, the last group of plants was what we would call the hybrid collection. This was where, and it was many times the exotic plants like marigold, sweet pea, geranium, carnations, begonia, they would become proliferous through new hybrids. The hybrids were being produced in Europe, in Belgium, Holland, England, France, and of course in the US as well. And hybrids of these plants were always included in the catalog. Today, if you look at Vick's catalog, for example, you see the begonia, you see the geranium, you see the sweet pea, but you see varieties or hybrids that were important to them, cultivars that were important to them, but have really gone by the wayside simply because we have bigger and better plants to choose from today. For example, in the case of the petunia, we have the wonderful series by proven winners called Supertunia, which is an absolutely glorious plant for the summer. But the petunia, it's basically a petunia, but it is a different hybrid or another cultivar of that plant. So this was important that Vick offer these kinds of plants for the Victorian flower garden. Now keep in mind that other people were also selling seeds for the Victorian flower garden, and many of them included some of the seeds from these four groups. But these were basically the groups that Vick used to fill his Victorian garden. I'm now, that's a little background for Vick and his garden choices. I'm going to read a section from the book. For more than 20 years, for the 20 years that James Vick managed his company, he devoted himself to spreading the love of flowers. He once wrote, "How we do admire the true, hearty love of flowers, with no sham, no straining for effect, no anxiety about what people will think, no ostentation, but a genuine, whole-souled love of the beautiful creations of infinite goodness and wisdom." The story of James Vick's success centers on his bond to the many gardeners who sought advice from him, read his catalog and magazine, and bought his seeds. The several methods Vick used to build a relationship with his customers reflect his deep sense of ethics at a time when businesses were free to entice customers in any way they chose. When he spoke of his desire to spread the love of flowers, his passion convinced his readers of his honest intentions at a time when many businesses sought hype over integrity. Phineas T. Barnum became a voice for such a crass view of promotion. Anything to get one's name in the paper became his credo. At that time, the country was entering an era in which multiple means to promote a company or a product became available. Department stores like Wanamaker used many methods to entice customers, mostly women, to enter the store and purchase items he provided. Wanamaker's publicity methods including decorated store windows, billboards, special teas held in the store, and newspaper advertising. Vick issued his first seed catalog in 1861, the same year that John Wanamaker opened his first store in Philadelphia. The methods Vick used to build a relationship with his customers represented his own early version, what we now recognize as an integrated marketing approach. First and foremost, Vick had an abiding respect for the role of the media as an educator. He wrote, "We know and acknowledge the influence of the press. We want that influence always on the side of right. The press is one of the greatest educators in this land, and we want the people to receive a good education." An editor from a paper in Massachusetts wrote him once, "James Vick has done more to secure choice seed and import rare bulbs and plants than any other person in the United States. His being an editor and publisher for a score of years, where man's courage, patience, and temper is so tried, even purses made to suffer by slack subscribers and tardy paymasters, has not one whit lessened his ideas of beauty. For he has for the past years been using the pen, shovel, hoe, and exquisite taste in the floral department. So no one need remain ignorant of method or destitute of seeds and bulbs for flower gardens, if they but apply in season to him for supplies." Vick enlisted the counsel of J. Walter Thompson's ad agency, where Vick spent $100,000 a year to promote his seed company, mostly in magazines and in newspapers. We would know much less about Vick had he not published many of the letters he received from his readers. His readers often asked him to publish their letters so others could learn from their garden experience, whether it was a success or not. Another form of reaching his customers was to offer them framed chromolithographs of flowers that he sold. The colored illustrations, measuring 19 by 24 inches in size, often included at the bottom in tiny print the name of each of the flowers. Vick wrote, "They are made from paintings of flowers taken from our own grounds." State fairs gave Vick a chance to see the country and promote his seed company. He traveled to many of them and sometimes won awards for displays of his flowers. He also encouraged his customers to enter flowers from their own gardens, rewarding them if they received special honors. To give customers a chance to see his own work, Vick cultivated fields of flowers both at his home and his seed farm for customers to visit. In towns and cities around the country, Vick encouraged local seed clubs. In such groups, one customer would enlist others in the neighborhood to buy seeds as part of a joint order. The goal was lofty, to make a beautiful neighborhood, as Vick said. Vick wrote, "One or two in any place by a little exertion can persuade many who never before cultivated a flower to allow a few papers, seed packets, to be ordered for them." In his choice of methods to promote his company, Vick illustrated skill both in building up a list of customers and keeping his name in the public eye. The fact that he controlled much of this interaction with his customers contributed to making him one of the most successful seed merchants in the 19th century. Vick once gave a talk about his business to an evening class at the Rochester Business University. The local paper covered the talk and reported, "Mr. Vick illustrated the necessity for honest purposes, conscientious practice, persistent and skillfully directed labor, and liberality in all business dealings as essential to success. He exhorted all to elevate their self-respect as the only fit beacon in life." I'm going to conclude the reading with a very short postscript. Vick died in Rochester on May 16, 1882. In 1883, John S. Harris, the president of the Minnesota State Horticultural Society, mentioned both Charles Darwin and James Vick in his annual address to the members. Harris said, "I have to record the names of two men, whose labors have been largely for the benefit of farmers and horticulturalists, Charles Darwin and James Vick. Charles Darwin, who died at the ripe age of 74, was considered the greatest horticulturalist of the age. He was the author of many valuable books. James Vick, who died at Rochester, New York, May 16, was age 64 years. Although English by birth, he was truly an American horticulturalist, and his name had become a household word through his genial quality and his devotion to horticulture in all its departments. At the time of his death, he was at the head of one of the largest seed establishments in America, and his floral guide had a circulation of over 200,000. His success has been marvelous. His labors are finished, but the good he has done will endure forever. Thank you.
Wow,
Christine, take it over.
that's quite a story. I got to tell you, your book is a great read. And not only am I enjoying the story, but really loving all of the lithographs and the colored prints. They're just fabulous all throughout the book. And they really bring it alive. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to give a shout out to James Vick's great-great-grandsons, James Vick and John Vick. John lives in California and James in Connecticut, who gave me the magazine and the whole series of the magazine, Vick's Illustrated Monthly, and then a part of their collection of the lithographs. So I owe a lot of that to those two for their help in giving this color to the book.
Well, that's really cool because I think when I met you for the first time, it was like 2007, 2008, something like that. And you came into my office at the Rochester Civic Garden Center and asked if you could do research on James Vick in our library. And I mean, such a small world. I know James Vick's great-great-grandson. I designed a garden for him. And when I was doing that, he showed me one of those lithographs and told me a little bit about his family. But I had no idea what a mover and shaker James Vick was until you came into my office and started talking about him. So I don't know, it's just sort of interesting how things go around. But I'm curious, what drew you to James Vick and writing a book about him?
Well, Rita Mae and I used to come to Rochester to visit our friends who lived in Greece. And we would come during the summer. And I would often find myself going to the library to look up things because I like to do that as I'm a teacher. So that's kind of a native thing I do. And one day I looked up, I was looking up gardening in the 19th century and I came across the name James Vick. So I asked the librarian, who's James Vick? Oh, he said, oh, he's a famous seed company man from the 19th century. That's about all he could tell me. And I thought, famous seed. So that kind of opened the door. And I didn't know anything about him. And I stopped at a used bookstore in one of my trips. And I asked the guy at the used bookstore, do you have any books about James Vick? And the guy said, no, we don't. I said, that's funny. He's from Rochester. Funny, we don't have any books. But that's, so I then researched in all the sources that I had in Rochester, including the University of Rochester, Strong Museum at that time, your center where you worked, the Rochester Historical, and I was really floored at how much material there was about him. So I collected it for a long time and then finally put something together.
Oh, okay. Well, I know years and years of research went into this book. And so yeah, I was just curious as to where else you found information. So was it mostly in Rochester?
That's a great question. I discovered that the University of Delaware has a complete collection of all his catalogs, and that's a very hard thing to find. So I applied for a grant and I went down there for about 10 days and I just devoured those catalogs. I read, they began in 1960 or 61 and ended, of course, his ended in 1882. They continued after that for a while when his sons took over. But I was really interested in the catalogs while he was alive. So the University of Massachusetts at Amherst has a wonderful collection of all his magazines
Oh,
And
wow.
so that was really helpful. And they took a lot of photos for me, black and white illustrations. I was very lucky there. And when I went to the Smithsonian, uh, the Museum of History, American History, they had a big collection of his material as well. So those were kind of major, outside of Rochester, major sources for me.
When you interviewed the family members, were you able to get a sense of who James Vick was?
Well, when I talked to James, I've only talked with John over the phone
Mhm.
a few times, and he's been really helpful, especially with the images. When I talked to James, certainly the highest regard for his great grandfather. He knows he's part of that legacy, and he was quite interested in having this book published. I know that. That's why he was willing to let me use his magazines for really a period of months. So both John and James are, I know, are quite excited about this book. So, and I'm happy that I was able to provide it. And I'm happy Ohio University Press was willing to publish it, of course.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
You know, Tom, what has stuck in my mind for years, that first meeting with you when you came to do research, you said, I didn't really know very much about James Vick, and you were telling me about him. And you said, James Vick was the Martha Stewart of his time. I thought, wow, that's quite a statement. I got to find out about this guy. So could you tell me a little bit about what you meant by that?
Well, that was an early statement. I don't know if I'd say that today, but I did say it at one time. And I think I could still make a defense for it. For example, if we look at Martha Stewart as one who provides what is the latest fashion, what's the thing to get, what do people need? Vic, in one particular area, was really uh, emphatic about container planting of flowers. He insisted, first of all, that you have only 2 containers on the property, usually outside or near the front door, along the pathway to the up the steps, and that both of those containers have identical plantings, and there be 3 plantings in them. There would be a big one in the center, like a ricinus or a canna or a banana plant, and then one plant in the middle, kind of fanning off like a petunia, and then one below like a coleus, almost touching the ground. So it was quite tall, and the planter always had to be on a stand. It couldn't just be by itself. It had to be on a stand, and you always had to keep that bottom flower, whatever it was, the vine clipped so that it would never touch the ground. Those were things that he insisted in his magazine and in his catalog. The care of potted flowers. That was really big for him. Otherwise, he was pretty open to whatever the design was, whatever the fashion was. I mentioned this earlier. He was very interested in promoting what we would call the carpet beds, which I mentioned in my talk. But he also, when perennials came around, which was at the late 1870s, early 1880s, there was a renewal of interest in perennials, and he was on the bandwagon for that as well. He saw that these very complicated and expensive carpet beds were going to go by because they're too much work and too much money, and therefore people needed to plant perennials, which is what they did. And he then sold perennials in his catalog. So those were a couple of, I might have been thinking about that at that time.
Well, actually, when I was reading your book, that statement always stuck in my mind. And, you know, it struck me that he had very specific ideas on just about everything. I mean, he had, you know, what you were just talking about with the containers, but he also talks about flowers in the vase and how they should be displayed. And he's
Yes.
particular about it. And it seemed like all of his layouts and his ideas, he was very Martha about it. I mean, he
True.
definitely had his opinions and he made them known.
He would often include in his magazine or catalog a drawing, a plan for a house and a landscape. And he would say, I am presenting this here for this person, whoever the person was, Kansas, wherever they're from. It is designed for him, for his property. Do not copy it exactly as it is. You have your own property with your own dimensions and your own issues to address. So he realized people would use that and probably copy it. to a certain extent, but also he created that just for that one homeowner.
Yes, yes. You know, the first sentence in the chapter 1, I mean, you totally nailed it. You're right. James Vick wrote his seed business into existence. I mean, I was like, what? You know, I had to find out more about this guy. I mean, how did he go from being a publisher and a writer to an accomplished horticulturist and seedsman? I mean, he was like, he did everything. How
He
did he
did
do that?
everything. He did everything. I must say this, when he was working at the magazines early on in the 50s, he was growing flowers at his house. So he was writing in those magazines when he was a horticultural editor about things he had experienced in his own work there. So he had been interested in floriculture for a long time in his own way. But he certainly brought the dimension of writing skills. There is no seed company owner that compares with his writing skill, I think, in the 19th century. He has the quintessential garden magazine done so well because he is in the seed business. He knows what people need to know. And so he puts that in the magazine. And Meehan, who was a nurseryman from Philadelphia, said that in the last 20 years of his life, James Vick had the best garden magazine in the whole country. And this was a man who had a magazine, Gardener's Monthly. And he said that James Vick had the best garden magazine in the whole country, which is really quite an accolade. But he was, so the more I looked at him, the more I saw his skills.
Just interesting, you know, that's interesting that you say that he had been gardening all along. I didn't know that, but his first magazine didn't do too well because he didn't have the seed business behind it to back it up. And I guess I'm figuring he didn't have the money for
Correct.
the seed business
Correct.
in order to keep it going.
Correct. Like Meehan's in Philadelphia had a huge nursery. And he also published this magazine every month. And if the magazine didn't do well, the nursery kind of carried it for a month or two if the advertising was low or something like that. But Vic did not have, didn't have this when he had the earlier experiences as publisher. With the Horticulturalist, for example, he had to sell that because he couldn't afford it anymore. And the other magazine, Rural, Annual, and Horticultural Directory, the same thing. But I must say it was fun to write the book. Finally, to see it all come together, because I didn't know that I was going to really be talking about flowers until I finished everything. And it's really the story of his love of flowers.
Yes. Yes.
And the Victorian flower garden that he grew is the same garden we grow today, only with newer varieties of plants.
Right, right. You know, one of the things that really impressed me is he was so popular with his customers. Oh my gosh, I mean, people wanted his photograph, and
Yes,
he was
yeah,
getting like upwards of 3,000
right.
letters a month and had to have a staff to help him answer them. And then
Yes,
he would publish their letters and write articles about their letters. I mean, and then everything that was written about him. I mean, he was like the god
he
of
was really loved. One writer said, if you were running for office, I would not only vote for you, but my whole town would vote for you. So he really had a gigantic audience out there.
he knew how to connect with people, didn't he?
Yes, yes.
And you know what kind of prevails throughout the story, you know, that you tell, he was so passionate about growing flowers, and he really and truly believed that it would make the world a better place.
Right.
I mean, it's so, you know, the power of that is so incredible. And I couldn't help but think about like everything that's going on now. You know, I mean, gardening has become very, very popular since COVID hit because people are home, they're depressed, they need hope, they need something to latch onto. And, you know, here it is, gardening. I mean, gardening makes everything better. Flowers, you know, take away the pain. They, you know, they give you hope and peace and something to live for. And it's just
Exactly.
really kind of an interesting parallel, isn't it?
It is, and he knew that. That's a good observation on your part. He knew that it would be helpful on so many levels to people who garden. If you
Yeah,
don't have a garden, start one. if you just have a vegetable garden, grow flowers, still have a flower garden. He was really insistent on that over and over again. So he wanted to teach the love of floriculture. That was his goal in life, to teach the love of floriculture. And he certainly did in so many ways.
He did. And, one of the things that I found really interesting is that, he lived in the Victorian times where, civility and community and morality, it really ruled. And I'm just curious, how did he relate his business and his love of horticulture to like hit people with that at this time? I mean, what do you think his strengths were in that
Well,
way?
he had a strong business ethic, and I mentioned that in the talk he gave at the Business University. And he knew how to run a business really well. He knew how to run a business successfully with the highest standards. That's what I have to say. It really comes out over and over again. And from the testimonies, I got to say this, the testimonies that people gave of him after he died from everywhere, all over the country, that he had this kind of reputation.
Yeah, just reading about him and how he connected with people and how he conveyed his love of flowers and his enthusiasm. I mean, you were writing the book about him, and I was like reading this and I was thinking, this makes me A, want to be a better writer, and B, a better gardener, and C, a better person all the way around, I mean, like all of these moral ethics and, all of these kind of like strict adherences to being always honest and truthful. And, I mean, it was just so cool the way he put all that in his business.
Right. And it's going to help you physically, mentally, emotionally.
Yes, and he truly believed it. And I mean, his belief just comes through in every single thing that you read.
Right.
Yeah, it's wonderful the way, that all came together. One thing I'm curious about, you were mentioning that you were looking at some of the old magazines.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, did you look at the magazines after he died?
I really was careful not to spend too much time on that period because I was really interested in James Vick's period of time with the company. His sons took over. It became James Vick Sons Company after
Right.
his death, rather. And that the company was bought out by Burpee in the 1920s.
Right.
So it lasted for about 25, 30 years. It lasted after Mr. Vick's death, and it continued to sell seeds, continued to be in business for that period of time. So, but I was more interested in kind of going in depth while he was in charge of everything.
Well, the reason I asked is in the book, you were talking about how he spent somewhere around $100,000 a year for, advertising and, his catalog. And, like during a time where like farm journals and other magazines and stuff, they didn't have a lot of color plates. They
Right.
probably didn't have a lot of artwork. I mean, his was like chock full of like these wonderful lithographs and
Right.
colors and then the wonderful writing. I mean, it's no wonder that he was successful with people. I mean, to get something like that in the mail during those times, it must have been amazing. And I just asked the question about the later issues because I know his son discontinued doing that they
Right.
really cut the budget back. And
Right.
I'm wondering what the magazine looked like afterwards.
His son, this is according to one author who knew the two of them, his son stopped the $100,000 that was paid to the advertising firm after Mr. Vick's death. I know that, and that the business took a little shake with that loss.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he certainly was a man for all seasons, wasn't he?
He was without any question.
Yeah, boy, I wish I knew him. But Tom, I think that your book does a very good job of kind of making him a real person and getting a feel of who he really was.
Well, thank you.
Great story.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate your presence today. Thank you. This was the launch and you were there. Thank you. I appreciate it so much.
I know his son, his great-grandson, is going to love it. Great-great-grandson,
Thank you.
James.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll have to give him a call and ask him what he thought of it.
Well, tell him that we met so many years ago, and when I brought his name up and you gave me his name, it's a
Oh,
wonderful how it
nice.
all comes together. It all comes
I'm
together.
going to have to go back and check up on his garden. Well, thank you, Tom.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Congratulations on the book. Thank you to Christine Froelich. Buy the book at Ampersand Books. You can catch up with videos of our readings on our website, including this one will be up there. And I want to say thank you for coming and have a great evening.